Hi everyone and welcome to Isami Rat Care. So today's video is going to be all about introductions, and I've done another introduction video before, but it was more looking at kind of older rats. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kitten introductions here because there are some little bit of differences, some things that you need to take into account. And as kind of key demonstrators in this, I have my two Kiefer kittens from the kind of last round of litters, which is brief introduction. Lovecraft Wig Twizzle or Twizzle, and Isamu Giggleswick or Wick. So they're both actually currently fully introduced to my group, and I've done this slightly different way around than I normally would do, in that I've been filming it over the last week since I started introductions, and then caught up and actually do the waffly bit at the start later on, purely because time-wise I've had quite a busy week recently. So what do we need to think about when we're thinking of kitten intros? Now, the first thing to consider is how the relative age affects things. So being very young, it makes things like, it means that they're not quite as physically robust, and it's something that we need to take into account and use that to judge when the best time to do the introductions is. So for instance, when you're talking about in terms of weak ages, I would not really consider introducing kittens under 6 weeks. To be fair, 7 or 8 weeks is normally a better time, and if you're getting your rats from a breeder, for instance, they're likely to only hold them at 7 or 8 weeks, so that's quite kind of normal. And in some cases you may choose to give them a little bit longer, and that might be if the rats are particularly small and weedy. If you've got a particularly asshole of a rat in the cage, so you want to make sure they've got a little bit more bulk and so on. So I would generally say between about 8 and 10 weeks is usually roughly the sweet spot for most kitten introductions. Now I say most because there are exceptions to this. So with does, so that's girls, you can have a little bit of a problem with kittens being too young. Now, when I say that, it means certain adult girls don't like young kittens. I've got one in my cage at the moment, Tato. She's not a bad rat by any means, but she just finds kittens annoying and feels the need to tell them off at random times for no particular reason. Once they get past about 12-13 weeks, she's normally pretty fine with them. Maybe once they're about 4 months, they're great, you know, she treats them as a normal member of the cage. Up to that point, she's a bit of a bitch with them, if I'm entirely honest. And that kind of thing does seemingly happen more often in girls. I've not really seen it in boys. They tend to find kittens more tolerable, and once they get to about 12-13 weeks and they physically kind of mature, so we're talking male kittens here. In fact, you can literally detect the change yourself with your own nose. They go from smelling kind of like very mild, quite like does, to literally one day smelling kind of musty and like adult bucks, and it's quite a distinct trigger over like the course of a day or two, when suddenly they become kind of adult bucks effectively to other bucks. They may still be quite small and quite innocent and quite playful in themselves, but suddenly they're seen as much more of a threat. So with does, if your intro is being a bit painful, then it's actually no bother at all to stop and then restart when they're, let's say, 3-4 months old, because you've got somebody that might not be enjoying the kitten's company, let's say. Whereas in bucks, whilst if it genuinely isn't going well, you are best stopping and restarting later, usually after you've thought about changing something like castrating someone. It's not going to resolve just based on the kitten's age alone, because generally if they're younger, the boys will prefer it, and that is within reason. Obviously you don't want to go much below that kind of like 7 or 8 weeks minimum threshold. You also need to bear in mind their kind of overall size. So these girls are a great size for their age. They're quite solid, they feel kind of substantial. I'm not worried at all, or I wasn't worried last week even at introducing them, because they have that kind of like bulk to them, that mass. They feel kind of substantial, they don't feel like skin and bones. And I will say, if you've had adults for ages and ages and you suddenly get kittens, they're always going to feel quite small, but there is a difference between a rat feeling small and a rat feeling insubstantial and kind of bony, and they'll probably need a little bit longer to come on. So kind of like the age thing does matter, the kind of size, and that is because if there is trouble, you want the kittens to have a certain amount of robustness to them. You want them to be able to take a little bit, so that, thank you, that is my ear, so that you can intervene if needs be and they don't get kind of badly injured. it is rare that that kind of thing happens, but it can happen, and you should always plan with that in mind as the worst possible outcome, knowing that in the vast majority of cases that's not going to happen if you manage things well. So next stage, what kind of intro to do? Now, I pretty much always favour starting with a carrier method with kittens. In fact, basically everybody that's come around to pick up their kittens and have help with introductions, we've been doing a carrier method with, just because it is quite reliable. It just kind of, it happens and it works quite well, and it's something that you can just kind of like get on with. In some cases you may need to rethink that kind of introduction method, and at some point I will do some videos on some of the other introduction methods, but I tend to do more on the carrier method because ultimately it's what I use in the vast majority of times because it works well for me and my rats. So that is what we also call the small space method, and that's putting them in a small space to start with and building it up. Just like my previous intro video, that's what we're going to be doing with these girls. So that kind of approach works well. You can look at some of the other ones, but for now we'll focus on that method because it's what I've used, and talk about what works with that. So next thing to consider is when you're introducing kittens, you don't want to introduce a single kitten. For a start, it's very harsh on them. They become the centre of all the attention, and the intro is a lot more stressful. They don't have a friend to kind of confide in and spend time in, and that attention isn't divided amongst multiple rats. It's also longer term. Kittens need other kittens for social play. When you look at how kittens play with each other, they play with each other in a very different way to adults, and that's really important. So I would never think of introducing a lone kitten to my adults. Even though some of my adults are very playful and fun and still quite young in themselves, they're not kittens. They can't play. It's like asking a kind of 20-something-year-old to play with a 7-year-old effectively. They'll kind of have fun and such, but it isn't the same. We don't have the same imagination as a child, or the same ability to ping, do we girls? So that is one you definitely want to take into account. So when we're thinking about who we're going to introduce to in the group as well, what I tend to do with this kind of approach is we'll start off in a particular size cage. So I start off in one of my mini cages. I can always drop down to a show tank, which you've seen me use before. The reason I start, and I'll just show you a mini cage, it's got stuff in it, ignore the stuff. I would normally start without, and you'll see that when we get further on in the video. It won't have the hammock in for obvious reasons, but that kind of size. But I have 10 rats that I'm introducing, these two plus 8 adults. So I need a decent amount of space. I can put them in a show tank if they were kind of like really being arsey, but it's getting a little bit cramped in there if I'm honest for 10. So you do need to bear that in mind when you're thinking about where to put them. You also need to think about kind of the condition side of things. Make sure they have kind of good food through the whole process. It's a good distracting technique. Make sure that the adults are perfectly fine. So one thing I had to take into account with mine is, for those of you following Chocobo's story, you'll be pleased to know that we had her operation and removed her lump. This was really bad timing for my introductions because she was still recovering from a lumpectomy when I started my intros, and she's my alpha. But actually about 3 or 4 days in, she was sufficiently recovered that I thought I'd see how she gets on in the cage. She went around and pinned several people, sorted them all out, and everything went a lot more smoothly from there on. So she's kind of well and well back in with the group now as well. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of pass you on to the first kind of video that I filmed in this series. Basically, in the lead up to that video, all I'd done was I put the kittens in the cage and the adults in the cage all at once, no particular order, and just kept an eye on things. All the way through the process, we've had a fairly smooth running. There's been a few scuffles, and that's actually been quite good to film. One of those was with Tato, my baby hater, and one of those later on, I don't know if I actually filmed it, was Foo, when Wick pinned her, humped her, pinned her again, and Foo finally lost temper and decided to take it out on poor little Wick, who fully deserved being told off, I should say. And that is something to bear in mind with intros with kittens. Kittens need boundaries, so I would not be disappointed if there was the odd, she's trying to eat my earring. I don't often wear earrings, clearly she's found this out. Kittens need boundaries of some description. They need to know how far they can push the adult rats, and there are different ways they go about that, but as long as the kittens aren't getting hurt or really upset, then that's okay. That's kind of like something you should accept. So we'll go through the videos next, but as a really quick kind of overview, I can say that the kittens and the adults are now living in their full cage. They're quite happy in there. I do still have an on and off problem with Tato, which is likely to go on for a while. In fact, I'm considering moving her into a different group just because I do constantly add to this group with kittens, and if she's going to get stressed every time that happens, it's probably not the best thing for her. So I'm strongly considering seeing whether she'd live happier with a group of adults and see how she does with that. But otherwise the group is very bonded, they're getting on very well. Everybody actually quite likes the kittens, which is always nice. I can't blame them because you're lovely girls, yes you are. So it's going to be quite a nice group, and that's taken, it's been quite a slow intro for me because I've had to account for Chocobo and I didn't want to move fast because I didn't want to push her healing wounds. But I would say, why do they always insist on dancing around the microphone? I would say that it's probably, I started it on Sunday last week. I moved them fully into the big cage yesterday, so you're probably talking about 6 days fully in terms of the intro, maybe a little bit kind of less actually, but yeah, they've done very well and getting on fine, which is great. So over to the next series of videos. You know, we already know the result before we started, so it shouldn't be a great surprise to you. So intros have just started. I've basically added both the little babies in with all the adults apart from Chocobo, who's currently recovering from her surgery. As you can see, there's lots of kind of like sniffing and going over each other and probably no doubt peeing on each other. Little Wick, who's the little buff girl, so the blonde girl over there, she's got a lot of character and so far pinned Grandma Margaret and given her a groom on her belly and is just basically terrorising everybody. But they're being very tolerant. Twizzle is being a lot more kind of calm, not asserting herself quite as much, but is still very interested in the adults and they're interested in her. So this is going quite well, but you do need to remember that these are all family generally. Burko's the only one that's not related to the babies. Tato, who's currently having a good sniff of Twizzle, is probably the only girl in the group that I'm particularly like keeping an eye on because she is known to not particularly like kittens. She's the reason why Moomin has a small hole in her ear. The first time was her fault, the second time was Moomin's fault. And to be fair, the way little Wick's going, I think Wick is probably going to be the one that pisses most people off at some point. I should note there's a bit of interest in Mog in this as well, as she's been out keeping Chocobo company, and she'll probably go back out and continue to keep Chocobo company for a few more days. Chocobo's surgery means she's not quite up to introductions yet. She's sat on my shoulder at the moment, having a nice time. Having a wash actually, because I've just taken a wrap off her. But in a couple of days she'll be joining everything as well. But that's why you're seeing a little bit of interaction between Mog and some of the others. And actually it's quite good distraction tactics, because it's meaning that they're not entirely focusing on the babies as well. They're also focusing on poor little Mog. Yeah, there's Wick, who's going to get told off at some point. They'll get pissed off with her eventually. She's a typical rambunctious little baby who wants to have fun and play with everybody, ideally by pinning them, and doesn't quite understand her place in the pack is going to be at the bottom. So if not now, probably in a week or two she'll end up getting told off, hopefully with ears intact. She's a top ear, this helps. But she's definitely quite a handful, bless them, so I feel somewhat sorry for them. There's Mog doing her grandmotherly duties and trying to keep her clean. And actually she's taking that quite well as well, even if she's like full of energy and super excited right now. She's not resisting or getting upset. Now at some point it's likely that somebody will tell her one of the babies off and they will get upset and a bit defensive, and that kind of happens too. But we'll keep our eye out for that. At the moment I'm very happy. Intros are going very well. Everybody's quite relaxed and low-key around everybody else. Nobody's particularly fluffed. There's a couple in this corner that are bored out of their brains and asking why can't we have our breakfast yet, which I will give them food shortly. I like to give them a little bit of time to kind of get to know each other to start off with. I should also state I've started in this size cage, which I will sometimes start in a smaller show tank. There's a lot of rats in here, which adds to it, but I'm not hugely worried about this intro. I don't see the need to start in a smaller one. If I do have to move down or downsize, I will. What I'll probably do is block off a bit of this cage so it's only smaller, because there's a large number of rats. I don't want to cram them into a tiny space with low
low kind of ventilation, so I will probably leave them in here for now. I don't see the need to shrink this down. Everything's going very, very well. So I'll just stop the video for now and go and give them their breakfast, and I'll give you updates later on to let you know how things are going. So when I mentioned about Tato not particularly liking kittens, this is kind of a good example. She's got one of them pinned at the moment, is overreacting to a lot of situations. And actually you can see Mog is defending her granddaughter at the moment, as Tato is trying to work out and get a little bit calmed down. So you saw what was like classically her getting really upset and just getting wound up by the situation. Now, I left her that time. I'm probably going to end up getting her out of the cage and giving her a bit of a calm down, though actually she's fairly defluffed. She's definitely improved from it. Moomin's looking after her foster daughter. Well, it wasn't really fostered, but she has been out and played with him a bit and wondering why now Tato's getting so hot up after all the babies are behaving so well. But you can see now the kind of defensive behaviour that you might see, and when I say defensive, she's actually scared. She's not overreacting at all. What you can sometimes see is them backed up into the corner with their paws out and mouth wide open. Tato is one that overreacts to kittens, and now she's kind of like calmed down, realised that she was just being a bit silly, and Mog's gone to look after Wick there. Check she hasn't got any good food. Mog is known for eating food straight out of babies' mouths, as is Moomin. It's a family thing. But there, she's just kind of reassuring her a bit. Mog is a sweetheart. And actually Tato's back down to normal. So sometimes you let the dramas play them out, sometimes you kind of calm it down. Now Tato, from her past behaviour, has very rarely let things escalate to kind of serious injury. Well, she's never let things escalate to serious injury. She has kind of nipped an ear once, but that often is in kind of almost accident. And so I gave her the chance in that one, and actually she calmed herself down. If she hadn't, like I say, I'd have taken her out, calmed her down a bit, and then tried again. Now it's just a case of like the babies getting themselves settled down again. Mog hugging her granddaughter, making sure she's okay. And nobody's really looking after Twizzle, poor thing, because she's not quite as closely related. To be fair, she's Linny, who's this one here. She's Linny's niece. So she has got quite close family in here. It's just Mog has got one baby to look after, and she might go and help Linny out later on. Not Linny, sorry, Twizzle out later on. Right, so I'll leave them to it again. They're back to calm, but you can see the kind of things that can happen in kitten intros. So the girls and babies have now been upgraded. Everything's been going well for the past 24 hours-ish, which is roughly how long I've had them in together. We now have added Chocobo to the group because she's healing well. And you can see that everybody's enjoying the extra space. Wick has been very much over the top. After that initial kick-off with Tato, actually she settled right down and was quite happy. So everybody's very much kind of bonding well as a group at the moment, and I have no worries about this. I'll probably put in a hammock and such tomorrow morning. If anybody's interested in Chocobo, you can just about, but she should be climbing at this stage. You can just about see her wound, Chuck, which is going really well. It's quite a large one because her lump was 70 grams in total, but it's off and she's doing a lot better. And actually she's just very happy to be back in the group and able to get up to no good and beat up the other rats. But yes, I will give you an update as they get more stuff in and you'll see how the intro is going. But so far, very smooth intro, less a little bit of a tussle at one point, which I luckily got on camera for you guys. This is quite interesting actually. So the reason Fu, who's the one currently being pinned by Chocobo, kind of severely told off Wick was what you didn't see just before I started filming. Wick pinned her and just kept sitting on her belly and bouncing on it. So Fu had the somewhat kind of like natural response of next time she tried it, just telling her off quite firmly. So that wasn't necessarily a kind of bad thing as much as Wick acted like she was going to be murdered. What was quite interesting is Chocobo, who's just come back into the group and has always been my alpha, but obviously has had her surgery recently. I'm going over and putting Fu firmly in a place here. Of course, Twizzle probably shouldn't help. That will only piss off poor Fu, who's had quite a legitimate response to a rather annoying little baby. And I will say, Wick does definitely push her luck in this kind of stuff. But yes, Chocobo doing her job there, even though she's not far off her surgery. She's about 5 days past it now. She's still firmly in charge and an excellent alpha. So it shows you kind of the value of having this in your group. She can kind of calm down and diffuse situations very easily, which is lovely to see. As is fairly normal in my intros, the first thing I put in is a wheel, and this helps them kind of burn off energy. You do have to judge on the group of rats in particular, but mine do always tend to do a bit better with a wheel in there. They just kind of like I say, it gets rid of some of the kind of stress and energy of being in a small confined space. Currently they're disagreeing over who gets to run on it, but one thing to notice, I put it up quite high so there's no easy hiding behind it, and it's also right in the middle of the cage again, so there's no kind of corner that it can cause a trap kind of on. Burko, you can see, is far too big for this wheel, but it's perfectly fine for kind of like a short period of time just to give him something to exercise. He's trying though, bless him. This is a demonstration of when wheels are not the appropriate size, and this is a 12-inch wheel. He's trying. But yes, so this will hopefully help them settle down even faster. We now have various things in the cage. I've stuck to an open hammock, and then I've added a couple of climby things. At this stage I'm not including anything that's kind of enclosed or unsafe for them to kind of corner each other in. Mostly it's just about kind of giving them something else to be around and to play with, kind of distraction tactics. What I will say is whenever I fit out the cage I feed them first. This makes it a lot easier because they mostly stay on the floor and eating. As you can see, Wick is still quite interested in escaping, and actually we had one or two that did when I was putting it in. But so far it's been very smooth. We've had a couple of little kind of like tellings off of the babies, basically all of which Wick has probably instigated by being a little bit full of herself, bless her. She definitely takes after her mum. Her mum was exactly the same. But yes, getting on very well, and I'm not too worried. So they'll probably be in the main cage in a day or two, I would have said. We shall see how they get on. You can always get set. Things continue to go well in the introduction. They're very settled together. There's been no injuries so far, and it's been about 4 days now. I've moved a little bit slower because of Chocobo's surgery. I don't want to rush them. But actually things have been very settled, apart from 1 or 2 little tellings off for the babies, which to be fair, Wick deserved. But yes, no injuries, so completely in proportion and fine. So we'll be looking to upgrade these this afternoon. I would do it at this stage this morning, but I want to be around a little bit for it, and I've got to go off to work now. But it'll give you a bit of a feel. So we've now reached the point where they've moved back into their big cage. Literally just added them in. There's a lot of sniffing going on because there have been people in the cage in the meantime, just to give some of the other babies a bit of an experience for big cage. But so far going well, so I'll be monitoring them in this for a little while. You'll notice I haven't cleaned it out fully, given it a full scrub, etc. I only do that in rare cases, and it's generally not needed. If there's going to be kicks off, there'll be kick off whether it's empty or what. So I've moved straight from the Alaska to this. Now again, in some situations I wouldn't jump up so fast. I'd move to a bare SRS, like the not SRS, sorry, bit of a little Ventura like the boys are currently in, but bare. But it's kind of like different cages, different situations, different rats. This has been a very smooth intro and going very well. Actually the only reason it's taken 6 days up to now is because of Chocobo's wound, and I wanted to make sure it's well healed before she moves into the big cage. So
all going very well. So far a very successful intro, and I expect it to continue this way.